There is a specific kind of knowledge that changes everything. Not the knowledge that comes from reading, not the knowledge that comes from being told or warned or advised, not even the knowledge that comes from understanding, intellectually, clearly, with all the right vocabulary in place. There is another kind of knowledge entirely, a knowledge that lives not in the mind but in the body, in the nervous system, in the specific quality of awareness that arises when the psyche has finally, at a level beneath conscious decision, learned to recognize something that was previously invisible to it. Carl Jung spent his life studying this kind of knowledge. He was interested in the moment when something unconscious becomes conscious, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. The moment when a pattern that was operating below the threshold of awareness suddenly becomes visible, nameable, recognizable in real time. And he was equally interested in what happens to the structures that depended on that unawareness, when the unawareness ends. Because Jung understood something that most people, even those who have spent years studying narcissistic dynamics, frequently miss. The narcissistic structure does not simply become uncomfortable when the empath learns its pattern. Something structural collapses. Something at the very foundation of the dynamic, something that the entire architecture of narcissistic operation was built upon, is permanently removed. And what remains once that foundation is gone, reveals with extraordinary clarity what the narcissistic structure actually is, what it actually needs, and what it is actually incapable of doing when the person it was organized around can finally see it. This video is about that collapse, about what Jung documented as the precise mechanism through which recognition, genuine, integrated, embodied recognition, dismantles the narcissistic dynamic from the inside. Not through confrontation, not through anger or accusation or the exhausting work of trying to make the narcissist understand what they are doing, but through something far simpler, far quieter, and far more devastatingly effective. Through seeing. To understand what the narcissist cannot do when you know their pattern, we have to begin where Jung always began, with the mechanism itself. Jung identified projection as the primary psychological mechanism through which the narcissistic structure manages what he called the shadow, that vast repository of disowned, unintegrated psychological material that every human psyche accumulates through the process of development. Projection is not unique to narcissistic structures. Jung documented it as a universal human phenomenon. Every psyche projects. Every psyche contains material that has been deemed unacceptable, incompatible with the conscious identity, too painful, or too threatening to integrate. And every psyche finds ways to locate that material outside itself, rather than within. The difference lies in the degree, the rigidity, and the specific function that projection serves within the overall psychological architecture. For a psyche engaged in genuine individuation, genuine movement toward wholeness and self-knowledge, projection is a temporary state. The contents that are projected are eventually recognized, withdrawn, integrated. The shadow material that was located in the other is gradually reclaimed as belonging to the self. For the narcissistic structure, projection serves a radically different function. It is not a temporary state. It is the primary organizational principle. The entire psychological architecture is built around the continuous, urgent, and ultimately compulsive need to locate shadow material outside the self, to ensure that it never returns to consciousness, never becomes something that must be faced, integrated, or owned. This is not a conscious strategy. Jung was explicit about this. The narcissist is not choosing to project. They are compelled to project by a psychological organization that has never developed the capacity to do otherwise. The relationship between their conscious identity, the ego they present to the world, and their shadow is not one of avoidance. It is one of structural disconnection. The shadow and the ego exist in different psychological territories with almost no communication between them. And this structural disconnection requires constantly and urgently an external container. Someone whose psychological boundaries are permeable enough to receive what is being projected. Someone who will absorb, carry, respond to, and organize themselves around the shadow material that the narcissistic structure cannot contain within itself. Jung called this participation mystique, the unconscious fusion in which two psyches become entangled, and the contents of one flow freely into the psychological territory of the other. And he documented with great precision the specific condition that makes participation mystique possible. Unawareness. Projection operates in darkness. This is not a metaphor. This is a precise psychological observation that Jung made central to his understanding of how the mechanism functions. Projection lands on a recipient who cannot see it. Not because they are unintelligent or psychologically unsophisticated. Jung was careful never to reduce this to a matter of intelligence. But because the specific contents being projected are precisely the contents that the recipient's own psychological history has made most difficult to perceive clearly. The empath who receives the narcissist's projection of inadequacy may carry their own historical wound around inadequacy, which makes the projected inadequacy feel like confirmation rather than imposition. The empath who receives the narcissist's projected rage may carry their own historical relationship with anger that makes the projected rage feel like something they must manage rather than something being deposited. The empath who receives the narcissist's projected neediness may carry their own compulsion toward caregiving that makes the projected need feel like a call they are obligated to answer. Jung called these resonant points, the places in the recipient's own psychology, where the projection finds a surface that recognizes it, that vibrates in response to it, that makes the projected content feel, at some level, like home. This is why projection is so effective. It does not land randomly. It finds, with extraordinary precision, the exact psychological territory in the recipient where it will be received, absorbed, and mistaken for something that belongs to the recipient rather than to the projector. And it continues to function, cycle after cycle, dynamic after dynamic, as long as the recipient remains unconscious of the mechanism. The moment the recipient becomes conscious, not intellectually but genuinely experientially at the level of felt recognition, the mechanism encounters a fundamental problem. It has nowhere to land. Jung made a distinction that is worth examining carefully, because it is the distinction that determines whether recognition actually changes the dynamic or merely adds a layer of painful clarity to a dynamic that continues unchanged. He distinguished between knowledge about a pattern and recognition of a pattern. Knowledge about a pattern is what most people acquire first. They read about narcissistic dynamics. They learn the vocabulary. They can name projection, identify participation mystique, describe the cycle of idealization and devaluation. They understand conceptually what is happening to them. And yet the dynamic continues. Jung would not have found this surprising. He documented extensively that the unconscious does not respond to intellectual information. The psyche is not changed by concepts. It is changed by experience, by the specific, often painful, always deeply personal process of encountering its own contents directly, rather than reading about them from a safe conceptual distance. Knowledge about projection does not withdraw a projection. Understanding that you are in participation, mystique, does not dissolve participation mystique. Knowing the pattern of narcissistic operation does not immunize the psyche against the specific resonances that make the pattern effective. What Jung called genuine recognition is something different. It is the moment the psyche not only knows the pattern, but encounters it, feels it operating, senses it approaching, observes it in real time with a quality of awareness that is fundamentally different from the reactive, absorbed, unconsciously participating awareness of the previous state. Genuine recognition has a specific quality that Jung associated with what he called the development of the observing ego, the capacity of a part of the psyche to stand slightly apart from its own experience and witness what is happening without being entirely consumed by it. This is not detachment. It is not dissociation. It is not the cold removal of someone who no longer feels. It is the specific quality of awareness that arises when the psyche has developed enough internal space to observe its own reactions as they arise, to notice the pull of the familiar dynamic, to feel the resonance of the projection, to sense the invitation into participation mystique, and to choose from that witnessed awareness how to respond. This is the recognition the narcissistic structure cannot survive. When the empath develops genuine recognition, when they can feel the pattern operating in real time, not just name it in retrospect, several things happen to the narcissistic dynamic simultaneously. The first is that projection loses its primary landing surface. Jung documented that projection requires a psychologically unconscious recipient, not simply in the sense of being unaware of the mechanism, but in the sense of being unconsciously available to the specific resonances the projection activates. When the empath has developed the capacity to observe those resonances rather than be swept into them, when they can feel the pull of their own historical wound responding to the projected content, and simultaneously maintain enough awareness to recognize that pull as a pull rather than as reality, the projection encounters something it was not designed to engage. It encounters a witness. Not someone who is unaffected, not someone who no longer feels, but someone whose feeling is accompanied by observation, whose response to the projection includes, simultaneously, a part of the psyche that can see the mechanism clearly enough to refuse automatic participation in it. The projection lands and finds, not the familiar resonant surface, not the unconscious absorption, not the organizing of the empath's entire inner world around the projected content, but a quiet, clear, steady recognition. I see what this is. This is not mine. And that recognition, held clearly and without drama, is what the narcissistic structure has no response to. The second thing that happens when genuine recognition develops is that the narcissist's behavioral scripts lose their effectiveness. Jung observed that the narcissistic structure operates through a relatively limited repertoire of behavioral patterns, not because the person is simple or unintelligent, but because the underlying psychological need that drives the behavior is always the same. The need to externalize the shadow, the need to secure external regulation, the need to maintain the specific dynamic in which the other person's psychological world is organized around the narcissist's internal state. Every behavioral pattern the narcissist employs, the idealization, the devaluation, the projection of blame, the sudden vulnerability that demands the empath's caregiving response, the rage that demands the empath's managing response, the charm that demands the empath's admiring response. Every one of these patterns is designed to produce a specific reaction, and every one of these patterns depends for its effectiveness on the empath not seeing it coming. The idealization works because the empath has not yet recognized it as a precursor to devaluation. The vulnerability works because the empath has not yet recognized it as a manipulation of their caregiving instincts. The rage works because the empath has not yet recognized it as a projection delivery mechanism, rather than a genuine emotional response to a genuine grievance. When the empath can see each pattern for what it is, before it has produced its intended effect in the moment it is being deployed, the behavioral script encounters a fundamental problem. It has no audience. Not in the sense that the empath has become cold or unreachable, but in the sense that the specific unconscious availability the script was designed to activate is no longer present. The idealization is received and recognized as idealization. The vulnerability is witnessed and recognized as a behavioral pattern rather than a genuine expression of need. The rage is observed and recognized as a projection in motion rather than something the empath caused and must resolve. And the narcissistic structure, encountering these recognitions rather than the expected reactions, finds itself in a position it has virtually no capacity to navigate. Because everything it knows how to do was designed for someone who could not see it. Jung was precise about what this moment looks like from the inside of the narcissistic structure. The first response is typically escalation. When the familiar behavioral scripts fail to produce their expected effects, when the empath who previously responded with absorption, anxiety, appeasing, or engaging, now responds with quiet observation, the narcissistic structure's initial response is to increase the intensity of the input. If the idealization produced no absorption, the idealization intensifies. If the vulnerability produced no caregiving response, the vulnerability escalates into crisis. If the rage produced no managing response, the rage increases in severity. This escalation is not strategic. It is structural. It is what a system built on external regulation does when the external regulation it is seeking fails to materialize. It increases the signal in the hope that a stronger signal will produce the response that the weaker signal failed to generate. Jung documented this escalation pattern as one of the clearest indicators that the narcissistic structure is encountering genuine differentiation rather than suppressed compliance. The person who is suppressing their response, holding themselves back through effort and willpower, will typically break under escalation. The escalation finds the suppressed response and releases it. The person who has developed genuine recognition does not break under escalation, not because they are stronger or more disciplined, but because what the escalation is designed to find, the unconscious reactivity, the absorbed emotional state, the organized around the narcissist's psychological orientation, is no longer there to find. The escalation passes through the empath's field of awareness and finds nothing to attach to. And this, Jung observed, is when the narcissistic structure begins to reveal its actual architecture in ways that even the narcissist cannot fully conceal. The second response to the empath's recognition, when escalation fails, is what Jung called the collapse of the persona. Jung introduced the concept of the persona, that carefully constructed psychological interface between the inner world and the outer world, the face we present to others, the identity we perform in social contexts, as a universal human phenomenon. Every person maintains a persona. The question is the degree to which the persona is distinguished from the actual self, whether the person knows the difference between the face they show the world and the inner reality that face is presenting, or whether the persona has been so thoroughly identified with that it is experienced as the self. In the narcissistic structure, Jung observed that the relationship between persona and self is particularly rigid and particularly defended. The persona is not merely a social interface. It is a psychological fortress, constructed specifically to prevent the unintegrated shadow from becoming visible, to the self as much as to others. The narcissistic persona is maintained through external confirmation. It requires others to respond to it in ways that affirm its coherence, to mirror back the identity it is presenting, to provide the external validation that substitutes for the internal relationship with the self that the narcissistic structure lacks. When the empath in participation mystique provides this mirroring, when they're absorbed, organized around the narcissist psychological state reflects back the identity the narcissistic persona is presenting, the persona is stable. The fortress holds. When the empath develops genuine recognition, when their response to the narcissistic persona shifts from unconscious mirroring to clear, boundaried, witnessing observation, the fortress encounters a problem it was not built to handle. It is no longer being confirmed. Not challenged, not attacked, not confronted with evidence of its own inconsistency. Simply, not confirmed. The empath's witnessing awareness reflects back, not the identity the persona is presenting, but the mechanism the persona is performing. And this, the experience of being seen through rather than seen, is what produces the specific quality of narcissistic collapse that Jung documented with such precision. It is important to be clear about what collapse in this context means. It does not mean that the narcissist suddenly recognizes their own patterns, takes responsibility for their behavior, and embarks on a genuine process of psychological change. This can happen. Jung was careful never to foreclose the possibility of genuine transformation in any psychological structure. The individuation process is always available. The shadow can always, in principle, be integrated. No psyche is permanently beyond the possibility of development. But it is not what collapse typically looks like in the context of a relationship where the empath has developed recognition. What collapse typically looks like, Jung documented, is a rapid cycling through the available behavioral scripts as each one fails to produce its intended effect. Charm, when observation replaces absorption. Vulnerability, when compassion replaces rescue. Rage, when calm replaces anxiety. Devaluation, when recognition replaces self-doubt. Idealization, when clarity replaces hope. Withdrawal, when the empath does not pursue. Each script deployed, each script failing. The cycling accelerating as the structure attempts to locate the response that will restore the dynamic to its previous configuration. And beneath the cycling, beneath the increasingly desperate performance of patterns that are no longer working, the thing that the performance was organized to conceal. The void, the unintegrated shadow, the fragmented relationship with the self that has never been resolved, never been faced, never been brought into the light of genuine self-knowledge. Jung called this the confrontation that the narcissistic structure has organized its entire existence to avoid. And when the empath's recognition removes the external scaffolding that was making avoidance possible, the unconscious absorption, the compulsive caregiving, the organized around the narcissist psychological orientation, the confrontation becomes unavoidable. Now let us speak about what is happening inside the empath during this process. Because the development of genuine recognition is not a comfortable experience. It is not the arrival at a peaceful, invulnerable state from which the narcissistic dynamic can be observed with serene detachment. Jung was honest about this. The development of psychological consciousness, the gradual, often painful expansion of the observing function, is not a process that removes the empath from emotional experience. It changes the quality of that experience. It changes the relationship between the empath and their own emotional responses. In the state of participation mystique, the empath's emotional experience is not their own. It is the absorbed, entangled, unconsciously fused emotional state of two psyches in collision. The pain the empath feels and the dynamic is real, but it is not cleanly theirs. It is contaminated in the Jungian sense with projected material that does not originate in the empath's own psychological reality. This is why the pain of the narcissistic dynamic has a particular quality that many people describe as somehow worse than ordinary pain. It is not just painful. It is disorienting. It does not resolve. It cannot be processed through ordinary grief or ordinary understanding, because the contents being processed are not entirely the empath's own. As genuine recognition develops, as the observing function strengthens and the empath begins to distinguish, with increasing clarity, between what originates in their own psychology and what has been deposited there through projection, the quality of the emotional experience changes. The pain does not disappear, but it begins to become more legible, more clearly located within the empath's own psychological history, more amenable to the kind of conscious processing that Jung called integration. The empath begins to reclaim their own inner world, not all at once, not without difficulty, but progressively as recognition deepens, As each encounter with the narcissistic pattern is met with increasing clarity, rather than increasing absorption, the empath's psychological center of gravity shifts from the dynamic toward the self. Jung called this the beginning of genuine individuation. There is a specific quality to the recognition that the empath develops that deserves careful attention, because it is frequently misunderstood, from the outside and often from the inside as well. Genuine Jungian recognition is not superiority. It is not the satisfaction of finally seeing through someone who was once able to deceive. It is not the hardening of a person who has been hurt enough times to stop feeling. Jung was explicit that any recognition that carries the quality of triumph, any clarity that positions the self as above, more evolved, more psychologically sophisticated than the other, is not yet fully differentiated. It still contains a projection. The shadow is still being located partially in the other, now as someone to be seen through rather than someone to be absorbed by, but still as the primary carrier of what the empath has not yet fully integrated. Genuine recognition in Jung's framework has a different quality entirely. It is quiet. It carries no charge of vindication or satisfaction. It does not require the narcissist to be a villain in order to function, because it is not organized around the narcissist at all. It is organized around the empath's own psychological clarity. The empath who has developed genuine recognition can observe the narcissistic pattern with the same quality of clear, boundaried, compassionate awareness with which Jung observed it in his consulting room. They can see the mechanism. They can see the pain behind the mechanism, the structural wound, the arrested development, the shadow that was never integrated, and they can feel genuine compassion for that pain, without being available to be consumed by it, without organizing their own inner world around the management of it, without losing even for a moment the thread back to their own psychological center. This is what Jung called integrated empathy, and it is the precise quality of awareness that the narcissistic structure cannot engage, cannot manipulate, and cannot survive as the primary relational dynamic. Because integrated empathy does not provide the unconscious availability that the narcissistic structure requires. It provides presence, clear, boundaried, genuine presence, but not absorption. And absorption is what the narcissistic structure was built to extract. Jung observed something about the development of this recognition that is worth holding carefully. He noted that the capacity to see a pattern clearly is not achieved through the decision to see it. It is achieved through the accumulation of experience, through the specific, often repeated, often painful process of encountering the pattern enough times, in enough different contexts, with enough psychological material available for integration, that the psyche finally develops the internal structure necessary to observe it, rather than be consumed by it. This means that the empath who is still in the dynamic, who still finds themselves absorbed, still finds the projection landing, still finds their inner world reorganizing around the narcissist's state, is not failing. They are not weak. They are not insufficiently aware or insufficiently intelligent or insufficiently committed to their own healing. They are in the earlier stages of a process that takes the time it takes. Jung documented that the individuation process cannot be hurried. It can be supported by conscious engagement, by therapeutic work, by the kind of content that names the mechanisms clearly enough that the psyche can begin to recognize them. But it cannot be forced. The recognition develops when the psyche has accumulated enough experience, enough integration of the relevant shadow material, enough internal space between the stimulus and the response, to make genuine observation possible. And when it develops, when the recognition is finally genuine, finally embodied, finally felt as well as known, it is irreversible. This is the aspect of recognition that Jung found most significant. You cannot unknow what you have genuinely recognized. Not in the superficial sense of forgetting information, in the deeper sense that the psychological structure that made the previous unawareness possible has been permanently altered. The psyche that has genuinely recognized the projection cannot return to absorbing it as though it were its own. The psyche that has genuinely observed the behavioral script cannot return to reacting to it as though the script were authentic. The psyche that has genuinely seen the mechanism, felt it operating, named it in real time, maintained its own center in the presence of it, cannot return to the state of unconscious availability that made the dynamic possible. The recognition, once complete, is the end of the narcissistic structure's access to that particular psyche. Not the end of pain, not the end of difficulty, not the guarantee of a smooth and uncomplicated departure from the dynamic, but the end of the unconscious availability that the dynamic required to function. And that ending, Jung documented, is permanent. Let us return now to the question that opened this video. What cannot the narcissist do when you know their pattern? They cannot project effectively onto a psyche that can see the projection coming and recognize it as a projection. They cannot extract external regulation from a psyche that is no longer organized around their internal state. They cannot activate the compulsive caregiving response in a psyche that has learned to distinguish between the narcissist's performed vulnerability and genuine need. They cannot sustain the idealization phase with a psyche that recognizes idealization as the precursor to devaluation. They cannot use rage to produce the anxiety and managing response in a psyche that can observe the rage as a projection delivery mechanism rather than a legitimate emotional communication. They cannot use charm to produce the absorption and hope response in a psyche that can recognize charm as a behavioral script rather than a genuine connection. They cannot use withdrawal to produce the pursue and appease response in a psyche that can observe withdrawal as a manipulation rather than a natural consequence of relational reality. In short, and this is what Jung's framework makes so clear, they cannot do the one thing that their entire psychological architecture was built to do. They cannot use you unconsciously, because the unconscious is where the mechanism lived, and you have brought it into the light. Jung was careful always to frame this not as victory but as consciousness. The empath who has developed genuine recognition has not won a battle against the narcissist. They have completed a stage of their own individuation process. The narcissist has not been defeated. They have encountered in the empath's recognition the same invitation to consciousness that the individuation process extends to every human psyche. The invitation to finally look at what has always been there, to finally face what has been so carefully avoided, to finally begin the integration of the shadow that has been managing from outside through projection and external regulation. Whether they accept that invitation is not the empath's work to determine or facilitate. The empath's work is the recognition itself, the development of their own psychological consciousness, the recovery of their own inner world from the entanglement of participation mystique, the gradual, irreversible, ultimately liberating process of becoming genuinely visible to themselves. Jung called this individuation, and it is, in the end, not something you do to the narcissist. It is something you do for yourself. The recognition, when it finally arrives, does not feel like triumph. It does not feel like the end of pain. It feels, Jung observed, like the beginning of clarity. Like the first moment in a long time, perhaps in a very long time, when you can see with something approaching precision, where you end and everything else begins. And that boundary, that first fragile, hard-won, entirely real boundary between the self and the projection, is the foundation of everything that follows. Everything that individuation builds. Everything that psychological sovereignty rests upon. Everything that genuine connection, real connection, chosen connection, connection that does not require your dissolution, is made possible by. It begins there. With seeing, with knowing. With the quiet, irreversible, entirely internal act of recognition. That is what the narcissist cannot survive. And it is entirely yours. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe, and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe, so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark, one awakened mind helping another remember. Together we move beyond the dark.